Well, hello, and thank you for taking the time to explore the nature of abstract labour with me. And thanks once again to the Oxford Communist Corresponding Society for inviting me to give a little talk. Sadly, due to the global pandemic, we are currently avoiding close physical proximity. So therefore, our corresponding now takes the form of audio monologues. Anyhow, this particular talk of mine delivers a decent dose of Marxology, including a few short quotes from Marx and some claims about what he really meant, and so on. So, of course, getting too deep into Marxology is something to be generally avoided by all sensible people. And there's a very sharp distinction to be drawn between the goal of understanding what Marx thought about reality and the more direct goal of actually understanding reality. And obviously I'm very interested in the former goal, but my real goal is always the latter one, which is to understand reality. Now, it turns out, as we might expect, my version of Marx is someone who I thoroughly agree with. And perhaps in what I'm about to say, I don't spend as much effort as I should in carefully distinguishing between what Marx really meant and what I think he should have meant. And for that, I'll simply have to beg your forgiveness and give the excuse that the Marxology in my talk is really secondary to a much more important goal, which is that of understanding social reality itself. Okay, so with all that blather out of the way, let's begin. We all know that parts of reality represent or measure other parts of reality. A ruler measures length, a thermometer measures temperature, and so on. We created those measuring devices for a definite purpose. But the meaning of money, what it might signify or represent, is less clear. Money is clearly a human technology, which first entered the historical stage over 2,000 years ago. But precisely why humans create money and what its symbol may represent remains subject to controversy. Now, to be clear, by money, I don't mean actual coins or notes, but instead the numerical quantities we see stamped on coins or printed on notes or stored as bits in computers and so on. So to be precise, I should really say the unit of account. But saying money is simpler as long as we're clear about what we mean. Now, Marx tackles the meaning of money in his famously difficult opening chapters of the first volume of Capital. And he notes that the exchange of commodities in the market implies there's something equal or equivalent about them. For example, if I sell 20 yards of linen for £10 and then spend my £10 on a new coat, then indirectly 20 yards of linen have been made equal to one coat by the act of exchange. Now, if market prices were entirely random, we wouldn't have much to say because this equivalence would be accidental. But although prices fluctuate, they are not random at all. There's a very strong signal in the noise. Typically, you can't sell a pen and then buy a plane, and you can't work for a day and then spend your day's wage to buy a mansion. There are exceptions, but those exceptions serve to prove the rule. So, during any period of time, there are definite, well-established market prices that determine the ratios in which commodities can exchange. That is, are equalized with each other. A quick dip into any anthropological textbook will quickly reveal that humans can entertain the most diverse and extraordinary beliefs about how the world works and how we should conduct our everyday lives. What some cultures consider normal, others would consider quite strange and bizarre. And we rarely take an anthropological viewpoint on our own culture, and that's because it's hard to do. It requires stepping out of one's conceptual framework and looking at the ordinary and accepted as unusual and questionable. And we're not educated to do that. In fact, we're generally educated to do the very opposite. So let's take a moment to note how fantastical commodity exchange actually is. Only fervent occultists, keepers of highly esoteric knowledge, would dare to claim that everything we see around us, all the things and activities in the world, are, despite all appearances, really the same. That 1 kilogram of caviar, fish from the Caspian Sea, is the same as 1,000 different people living in different locations around the world clicking on the same internet advert. Or clowning at a children's party is actually the same as 200 rounds of shotgun ammunition, or that 1 month of computing time on a high-spec machine in the cloud is the same as 1 ton of potatoes. Only the mightiest adepts, schooled in years of training, devotion and meditation, could see the truth of such magical affinities and identities. But we more than see the truth of it. We openly and regularly achieve it. We manifest these magical affinities between diverse things on a daily basis. We treat quantities of fish eggs, human attention, clowning performances, bullets, computing time, potatoes, and a bewildering array of other things as the same, because in the marketplace they all may be exchanged for one another, mediated by this mysterious technology we call money. Traditional magic rather meekly proposes the existence of affinities between planets, stars, minerals, and human fate. But the magical operations of our modern commercial world, where everything, activity, and even future event is successfully reduced to comparable quantities of this substance we call money, overwhelmingly surpass in both scale and ambition the most deranged fantasies of the medieval grimoires. Market exchange achieves a universal affinity between all things under the sun. And it's for these sorts of reasons that Marx writes of the mystery of commodities, with its magic and necromancy. Market societies achieve a titanic conceptual abstraction. Every single thing that we swap between ourselves is stamped with a single quantitative property that we call exchange value. But rather mysteriously, no single person, no single consciousness is responsible for that abstraction that we call exchange value. And in the vast majority of cases, no human institution has the goal or the power to set prices. No one is controlling this abstraction. So we are faced with two economic mysteries: a ubiquitous social abstraction without any obvious content, and an abstraction without an abstractor. So I want to dispel some of the mystery about this, but also add to it. Science doesn't only explain, but it also discovers things that we didn't notice before. And in this talk, I will try to answer two questions. What does the abstraction of exchange value represent? And who or what is doing the abstracting? So let's begin with the first mystery. What is this abstraction? What do those money quantities actually denote? Now, Marx argues that exchange value refers to a special common property shared by all commodities, and that is of being the products of labour. So caviar and clicks are the same because to manifest them as commodities in the marketplace requires the sacrifice of someone's labour. Now, it must be admitted that Marx's argument for the proposition that the special common property shared by all commodities is labour, that argument that he gives is unsatisfactory. But fully stepping into the whys and wherefores of Marx's argument would, I think, divert us. So I'll simply state my opinion, which is this: Marx's conclusion is correct, but his argument for it isn't. And given that, let's just accept Marx's conclusion for now as a working hypothesis and keep going. So Marx then says that the common property cannot be specific kinds of labour, because fishing for caviar or writing advertising software, or clowning, or making bullets. These are all very different activities. And the act of exchange abstracts from the individual peculiarities of different labouring activities, leaving something common to all of them, which Marx calls human labour in the abstract, or abstract labour. Commodities, according to Marx, have economic value, and I quote, only because human labour in the abstract has been embodied or materialised in it. Now we have to be careful with the term embodied. Marx doesn't literally mean that abstract labour inheres within the material body of the commodity. Abstract labour is not a physical property of a thing. What he means is that some fraction of the total labour time of society must be used up or expended to produce the commodity and bring it to the market. So abstract labour is not concrete labour, not a specific type of labouring activity, but something else, something deeper and more general. As Marx states, abstract labour has, to quote, the character of the average labour power of society. So to a good first approximation, it's fine for us to think of abstract labour as denoting the causal powers of the typical or average worker. That isn't quite right, but it will do for now. So, according to Marx, the titanic abstraction achieved by commodity exchange refers to a specific content, and that is a property of the material world that he calls abstract labour. Now Marx, in the opening chapters of Capital, then immediately asks the obvious question, which is this. He says, how then is the magnitude of this value to be measured? And he answers in a seemingly straightforward way that it is to be measured, again quoting, by its duration, and labour time in its turn finds its standard in weeks, days and hours, end quote. So we're talking about units of time. We might suppose, therefore, that we can immediately pull out our stopwatches and start measuring the amount of time people spend working, and then correlate our measurements with the prices we observe in the market. Because if prices really do represent labour time, then we should, in principle, be able to scientifically verify this claim. Now, without pronouncing any judgment on that empirical research program, let's just say that would be too hasty. Before we can even consider empirically verifying Marx's theory of value, we need more clarity on what that theory actually is. Theory has to precede measurement. Now, I'm not sure how deliberate this is, especially as I read Marx in translation, but it might be noteworthy that Marx does not ask, how should we measure quantities of abstract labour? And neither does he answer by saying that we can measure it by its duration. And that's because we don't measure abstract labour. Something else measures it. And this property of Marx's theory, that money refers to labour time in virtue of our collective social activity and independently of our thoughts about it, is radically different from the classical political economy of his day and also modern economic theory. The abstraction is not ours because our cognition is not performing the abstraction. We are not the abstractor. Instead, the mysterious abstractor is taking the measurements about labour time and connecting the form of value, which is money, to its content, which is abstract labour. So as scientists, our first job isn't to start measuring labour time. Our first job is to understand what the abstractor is and how it connects its abstraction to its world. We need a theory of this entity and its powers before embarking on empirical verification. So we have a partial answer to the first economic mystery. The abstraction of exchange value, or more plainly money, refers to abstract labour. So let's turn to the second mystery. Who is doing the abstracting? Who or what is the mysterious abstractor? In fact, Marx has already told us who it is. And sometimes mysteries hide in plain sight. The big clue is Marx's choice for the title of his magnum opus. The abstractor is what Marx calls capital. But the term capital, especially now, doesn't evoke the right images and associations. First of all, it gets us thinking about large sums of money, a capital sum. But Marx isn't really talking about big sums of money. And second, modern economic theory has reduced the term capital to an anodyne accounting term that manages to mix up, in a confused way, capital equipment with large sums of money. But capital for Marx is first and foremost a social practice. Capital denotes a collection of activities that certain people regularly do, embedded within a system of property rights, contracts, and coercive power. Capital is a circuit where an initial capital sum is invested in production and then typically returns with a profit increment. Capital enlarges itself whenever it can. And this circuit is mediated not only by money, but also economic production itself, including the disciplining and exploitation of workers. Marx's language of capital, of social relations of production, circuits of accumulation, and so on, doesn't, in my opinion, fully evoke what's going on. So instead of saying just capital, I'm also going to say the controller, because capital is a control system, not merely in the political sense, but in the more profound and scientifically important sense of being a negative feedback control system. Capital is literally a controller. So if capital is a controller, then how does it work and what does it control? In a fully capitalist system, profit income must be reinvested in order to make more profit. And this is the prime directive for anyone who possesses a capital sum of money. If this directive isn't followed, the capital will rapidly diminish and expire and cease being a capital at all. Now, owners of capital, that is capitalists, can't put all their eggs in one basket. That's too risky because firms can go under, assets might depreciate. So capitalists own a portfolio of investments with different risk profiles, such as government bonds, shares in different companies, and more speculative bets in high growth sectors. Each individual capital attempts to maximize the return over its portfolio. And if it fails, it will diminish and eventually cease being a capital at all. And it's right here that we find the causal structure of a feedback control system. Capital has its own goal state, sensory inputs, decision-making, and ability to act upon the world in which it is embedded. So let's take each of those bits in turn. First, the goal of an individual capital is to maximize the average return from every dollar or pound invested. Second, the sensory inputs are the different profit rates earned across the portfolio. Third, the capitalist or the financial experts they employ compare the different profit rates. And four, the feedback loop is closed by actions that withdraw capital from poorly performing investments and inject capital into high-performing investments. This control loop manifests as an insatiable and ceaseless search for high returns. And the control loop doesn't care how its capital is actually used in production. It entirely abstracts from all concrete activities. The only thing it can sense, compare, and use is abstract value. So the commanding heights of the global economy consist of an enormous ensemble of individual capitals, each manically scrambling for profit, reacting to the signals of differential returns received from its tendrils that extend to every productive activity under its rule. It continually injects and withdraws capital to and from different industrial sectors and geographical regions. The entirety of the world's material resources, including the working time of billions of people, are repeatedly marshalled and remarshalled away from low and towards high profit activities. In the space of months, entire industrial sectors may be raised up, relocated, or thrown down. Capital concentrates in few hands, and in consequence, the scale and power of some capitals rivals the titans of old. Now, All these autonomous control loops have the single-minded goal of extracting profit from the world's activities. If an activity fails to satisfy this goal, then the controller withdraws its capital and the activity stops. So, at the apex of the economy, we have a competing collection of identical controllers with an atavistic low level of intelligence which inject and withdraw a social substance that appears to possess the magical power of animation, of bringing things alive, of creation, but also appears to possess the demonic power of annihilation, of suffocation, of bringing things to an end, of destruction. And that is the vision I want to communicate, that capital is a control system. The money substance which it deals in flows into and through every aspect of our social intercourse like blood in veins. But what does this controller actually control? Now, sometimes it's obvious what a particular control system controls because we designed it. For example, we know that a thermostat controls room temperature and that a governor controls the speed of a steam engine. But the vast majority of control systems are not designed by people. Nature is stuffed full of them, from simple homeostatic mechanisms to incredibly complex animal brains. These systems evolved without a designer, and therefore we have to work harder to determine what they control and what their internal representations may or may not represent in the environment in which they act. Now, I'm going to skip the details of a scientific theory to determine what controllers in fact control. And that's because it's not a simple story. And I think the complexity of that story partially explains why Marx's argument that abstract labour is the substance or content of value in the opening chapters of Capital, those chapters that he famously worked and reworked, that Engels joked bore the marks of his painful carbuncles. I think that's partly why his argument is not entirely satisfactory, because he'd stumbled upon a hard problem that couldn't be fully resolved with the conceptual tools of his time. So I want to skip that possible methodological detour and instead jump to the conclusion and simply state, without further argument, what capital as a control system in fact controls. We already know that capitals, both big and small, are intimately connected to the process of production. The capitalist firm needs to borrow capital to buy inputs and means of production and hire workers. Workers supply concrete labour to produce use values for sale in the market. Now, the controller judges all the different concrete activities occurring across its portfolio in the same way. Which activities yield above average returns and which don't? The controller rewards firms that make comparatively high profits with new injections of investment, but punishes firms that make comparatively low profits or losses by withdrawing its capital. These monetary rewards and punishments flow down through firms into the labour market and reward concrete labour by the payment of wages or punish by withdrawal and unemployment. And in this very real sense, capital wants specific kinds of concrete activities and does not want other kinds. And the kinds of activities it wants are those that yield above average profit. Capital is therefore controlling us. It controls how we spend our time. So we're beginning to close the loop. What kinds of activities does capital want? Simplifying somewhat, we can identify two essential properties that concrete labour must possess in order to yield profit. First of all, the concrete labour must be useful to others, that is, produce commodities that can be sold in the market. No one will buy a coat with 3 arms. Second, the concrete labour must have above average efficiency. In other words, a firm makes more profit if it uses up less labour time than competitors that produce the same commodity. And this is why, just after Marx first introduces the concept of abstract labour, he immediately points out that only socially necessary and useful labour counts as abstract labour. Capital doesn't want workers to spend time smelling the roses with their family and friends. That activity doesn't yield saleable use values. Neither does capital want workers to slack on the job or become ill. Slacking or illness isn't efficient. Capital, if it completely had its way with us, would have us spend all our time labouring in the firm at the highest possible intensity, continually striving to outcompete other workers in the labour market. This is the kind of behaviour that capital wants. So, capital controls concrete labour, the real labouring activities of the working population in all their diverse manifestations. And capital controls actual labour time, actual clock times of real people doing real things. It is capital itself that holds a metaphorical stopwatch in its hand, measuring and accounting and judging and condemning, always on the lookout for the slightest slacking off or insubordination. And the goal of capital is to convert concrete labour into abstract labour, into the kind of labour that both fits into society's division of labour, so it can be exchanged against other labour, other concrete labour, and also into the kind of labour that fully sacrifices itself to capital, gives itself up as tribute in order to yield profits for capital. In other words, abstract labour is manifested, brought into reality by capital itself. The maximisation of profit is identically the process of maximising the manifestation of abstract labour out of concrete labour. And this is why Marx says that only abstract labour creates value. Concrete labour may or may not create value. If it doesn't, it isn't abstract labour, and capital as controller quickly works to eradicate its existence by withdrawing capital from the firms that employ it. I think that viewing capital as a negative feedback control system is the best way to understand what it actually is, and to understand the fundamental role it plays in shaping our society and the kinds of lives that we are compelled to lead. The language of control systems is really just a more complete and precise way of talking about the dialectical relationship between the form of value and its content. So capital is a controller that employs a form of value, money, to control the content of value, which is our labour time. The form and the content are bound together, linked semantically in a relation of representation to referent by the lawful regularities instantiated by generalized commodity production. Now, one of the very interesting things about control systems is that they instantiate primitive versions of the basic elements of cognition. They in fact sense and decide and act. They in fact have internal representations that refer to the world they act in. And so in consequence, Marx's theory of value is fundamentally a theory about an alien cognition that controls us. His instincts were on the money when he wrote of the necromancy of commodity production, because only religious, magical and occult traditions in our history have formulated the adequate concepts to really express the predicament that we're in. Here's an example. An egregore is a non-physical entity that exists in virtue of the collective ritual activities of a group, yet operates autonomously according to its own internal logic to materially influence and control the group's activities. The group creates the egregore, and the egregore creates the group in a self-reinforcing feedback loop. In traditional cults, the egregore typically takes the form of a god. However, the ritual activities of the initial first capitalist cults were so materially successful they rapidly metastasized and in a few centuries engulfed the world. And what is universal becomes the unnoticed background. So the egregore in our society is hard to see, but it hides in plain sight. We do refer to it, of course, but obliquely, using soporific names such as the economy or capital. We need a better name for it, one designed to wake us from our slumber. Capital, being an autonomous entity which has primitive thoughts about us. Money is how it measures us, and money is also how it commands us. Capital is an alien cognition that acts in the world to bind together the form of value to its content. So I think we've made progress with the two economic mysteries. We know what the abstractor is now, and we have a clearer grasp, I hope, of the core structure of Marx's theory of value. And once we understand that core structure, the shape of it, it becomes much easier to spot misinterpretations of it. And I just want to briefly sketch the territory of those misinterpretations. There are some misinterpretations that emphasize the content at the expense of the form. So it's important to know that Marx's theory is not at all like the naive materialism we find in classical political economy or some of the modern Sraffian interpretations of Marx, which posit one-way causation from labour time to money prices. Instead, we need to think about feedback loops, about two-way causation, from content to form and from form back to content, because that's what the structure of Marx's theory is, and that's how, in fact, reality works. But there are other misinterpretations that emphasize the form at the expense of the content. Now, clearly Marx's theory is an objective theory of value. Despite the pretensions of subjective utility theories, we cannot collectively wish planes to be cheaper than pens. We are not the dominant controller, we are the controlled. But there are more sophisticated variants of subjectivism that also misinterpret Marx's theory. For example, some Marxists think capital dreams about abstract labour. Abstract labour is an invention of the capitalist system, which doesn't actually refer to something existing independently in objective reality. And so this is a kind of social constructivism where Marx's theory degenerates into a kind of postmodern parody of ghostly and ideal forms. And in these misinterpretations, the form doesn't really have a content. And so money doesn't really refer to a property that exists independently of it. The form creates an illusory content. And in this view, abstract labour may indeed have real effects in the way that our belief in Father Christmas may cause us to offer cookies and milk. But Father Christmas doesn't really exist. And neither does abstract labour. And this seems like a sophisticated position, but ultimately it reduces to value nihilism. There are only prices, and there is nothing hidden behind them. But Marx's theory is essentially about the control of concrete labour time, the actual objective working conditions of millions of people. Any interpretation of Marx that claims abstract labour cannot be measured independently of markets and prices, or cannot provide a definition of the content of value without relying on magic coefficients that depend on prices, that interpretation has gone awry. Of course, like any entity, capital's thoughts about its world may not perfectly reflect or represent the reality in which it is embedded. However, if a control system successfully controls, then its internal representations do bear a truthful correspondence to reality, and capital is a supremely successful controller. And ultimately, this is why we can verify Marx's theory. Labour is already disciplined to be efficient and useful, and so the majority of concrete labour is already abstract labour. In consequence, if we pick a group of 50 workers randomly, they will approximate the value-producing power of 50 units of abstract labour. If we take larger aggregates, then the approximation just improves. Taking out our stopwatch won't work at the level of an individual worker, because there's no guarantee that their concrete labour will count as abstract labour. But the stopwatch approach will measure abstract labour when we collect sufficient samples. As Marx said, abstract labour has the character of the average labour power in society. So it's the controlled success of capitalism which means we can measure quantities of abstract labour before that labour is equalised and homogenised in the market. So an analogy might help here to express this point. An ethologist studying the behaviour of an animal in the wild can't truly get inside the animal's head and see the world through its eyes. The ethologist can never fully know what it's like to be a bat, but nonetheless ethologists have developed detailed theories of echolocation and how a bat's cognition represents its environment. In a similar way, we are studying the behaviour of an autonomous entity called capital, which is an alien cognition. Abstract labour is its concept, not ours, but we can form a concept of abstract labour that corresponds to its concept of abstract labour. After all, we, the controlled, and it, the controller, all live in the same world, and we can both talk about and represent an objective property of it. And what is that objective property? And we got to a point now where we can refine our initial approximate definition of abstract labour. It is not just average labour or the common causal powers of human labour. It is something a bit more specific, something a bit more historically determined and therefore contingent. Abstract labour is a collection of causal powers possessed by humans that can manifest as an ability to produce an endless variety of useful things for others, to make profits by working harder or longer, to improve techniques of production so more may be produced with less, and to outcompete others in a ceaseless scramble for profit. If we workers lacked those causal powers, then capital would fail to mould us into the value-creating homogeneous units that it wants. So, let's draw to a close and I'll try to sum up. At the beginning we asked, what does money represent? And the answer is abstract labour, which is labour that creates profit for capital. And then we asked who does the abstracting, and the answer is capital does that, when we understand capital to be an autonomous controller that supervenes upon our social practices, but is not reducible to them. It's a kind of egregore. Now, the value form, that titanic abstraction that controls our lives, is, in a sense, the primitive language of the controller. It sees and judges our activities in terms of abstract value by comparing differential profit rates across its portfolio. But it also commands our activities using abstract value by injecting and withdrawing its substantial being, which is money. Capital commands us. Our real, living, concrete labour is the object of its control. It works to mould and shape and discipline the total labour power of society into the specific form of abstract labour, which is labour that gives itself up utterly and completely as tribute to capital. So the value form participates in both measuring labour time and also commanding labour time. And we shouldn't be too surprised that the value form also has imperative semantics. Generalized commodity exchange has no conscious planner or plan, and therefore the command and control necessary to organize a division of labor in society is achieved through the allocation of capital, the transmission of money, and the structure of prices. Capital commands concrete labor time to manifest as abstract labor time, and therefore brings into being what is already latent within us. But capital intensifies and perfects only a part of us. We are more than merely creatures able to manifest abstract labour. We have the power to do much more than merely produce useful things by working intensely for long hours. Now, of course, despite capital's rule, we do carve out pockets of resistance where we can be more fully ourselves. But capital does not want us to play or learn or explore or care or give freely. Capital wants us to produce endlessly, and therefore we, under the rule of capital, are reduced to shadows, mere narrow abstractions of what we could be. So allow me to finish with a very blunt analogy. Cows can do lots of things, but all we care is that they produce as much milk and meat as possible. And so we breed them, inject them, rear them, and control them to do only that. Sometimes their udders are so distended by excessive production they tear, split, and spill. We are cattle to capital. We too have become distorted and disfigured by its rule. It brands us as abstract labour, but we are also concrete individuals. The form does not exhaust the content, and this seemingly innocuous non-identity between form and content is the fundamental reason why one day we will escape from capital's rule.